A number of people have been concerned about the direction that the National Trust has been taking over recent years, and matters came to a head this August with the events at Felbrigg Hall in Norfolk. The National Trust decided this year to mark the 50th anniversary of the legalisation of homosexuality in Britain with a series of exhibitions at some of their properties which highlighted the lives of former owners who were or were alleged to have been gay. What they did at Felbrigg Hall was they made a film narrated by Stephen Fry telling the story of Robert Wyndham Ketton-Cremer, who was the last owner of the house before he gave it to the National Trust on his death. And he was outed as being gay. This caused a huge amount of offence to his godsons and goddaughters who are still alive, and his private secretary and people who knew him. It also upset an awful lot of volunteers at Felbrigg Hall who didn't like the hardline LGBTQ agenda that was being pushed through this exhibition at the property which they helped out at. And they refused to wear the rainbow-coloured lanyards and badges which they were told they had to by the National Trust's management. And this hit the headlines. The National Trust got quite a large number of unfavourable press articles, and particularly the fact that they were forcing these volunteers to do something which was clearly against their conscience, and they had to do a humiliating U-turn and say that the badges and lanyards would only be optional and no one was obliged to wear them. But what I want to look at in this video briefly is what is behind this embracing of the LGBTQ agenda by the National Trust, because the National Trust has until now been seen as quite a sort of, I suppose, an establishment organisation, but very socially and culturally conservative. You only have to see that by visiting the National Trust properties around the country, which I have done over many years, and seeing the kind of people who work there. And they are generally people with a sense of history, a sense of tradition, and people of fairly conventional and small c conservative social and cultural attitudes. So it's really quite odd that the National Trust should suddenly be going in this very extreme political direction. And what is behind it? Well, let's look at the National Trust's website here. Prejudice and Pride. So they say this year marks 50 years since the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in England and Wales. Throughout 2017, we will be sharing the stories of people who challenged conventional notions of gender and sexuality and who shaped the properties in which they lived. Well, that doesn't actually apply to Robert Wyndham Ketton-Cremer, because he didn't challenge conventional notions of gender. He followed the convention of the day, which is that you didn't talk about your sex life. Not just if you were gay, but if you were heterosexual as well. And he made no public statements about it. Whatever he did, he was discreet about it, and he respected the social conventions of the day. The University of Leicester team, led by Professor Richard Sandell, is not only helping to tell these previously hidden stories for the first time, but to break new ground in the way those stories are researched, presented and used to engage the public in debates around contemporary LGBTQ equality. So there we see an apparent attempt to use this campaign at the National Trust to push an LGBTQ agenda. Now, Richard Sandell is an interesting character. He's based at the University of Leicester, as it says, and he heads up, he's not an historian or an art historian or an archaeologist, which is the sort of academic you'd expect to work with the National Trust. He is actually Professor of Museum Studies. That's right. I mean, most people didn't even realise that there was such a subject of museum studies, but Leicester is one of the very few universities in this country, it may be the only one, but it's certainly one of the very few who offer this subject. And it's one of these fake academic subjects. What do I mean by fake academic subjects? How dare I say that? Well, it's a subject where you have to hold a particular ideological position. The idea that there is any dissent or debate within the subject is completely unthinkable. You think of another fake academic subject like gender studies. It's completely inconceivable that anyone would go into that on a course and would be awarded a degree if they held anything other than a feminist position. And the same seems to be true of museum studies. Now, Professor Richard Sandel has been quite prolific in his output. He's produced quite a large number of papers and books over the years. Here's one that he published a few years ago called Museums, Society and Inequality. And it gives you, even the title gives you a flavour of what's in it. Here's one of his more recent ones, Museums, Equality and Social Justice. And I just want to have a look at this very briefly to give you a flavour of what is being pushed in museum studies and then pushed onto the National Trust. So here is the description by the publisher, and it says, the last 2 decades have seen concerns for equality, diversity, social justice and human rights move from the margins of museum thinking and practice to the core. The arguments, both moral and pragmatic, for engaging diverse audiences, creating the conditions for more equitable access to museum resources, and opening up opportunities for participation now enjoy considerable consensus in many parts of the world. A growing number of institutions are concerned to construct new narratives that represent a plurality of lived experiences, histories and identities, which aim to nurture support for more progressive, ethically informed ways of seeing and to actively inform contemporary public debates on often contested rights-related issues. So let's just unpack that. That last sentence. A growing number of institutions are concerned to construct new narratives. Well, construct new narratives is what most people would just call rewriting history. And that's actually what it's aimed at doing, rewriting history. It doesn't like the version of history it sees presented by museums, and it wants to change it. It wants to change it in what they would see as a progressive, radical direction. And then he says later in the same sentence, support for more progressive, ethically informed ways of seeing and to actively inform contemporary public debates on often contested rights-related issues. Rights-related issues. Well, essentially this can be summed up as postmodern cultural Marxist identity politics. These are the things which are close to the cultural Marxist's heart. Issues about gender, race, sexuality, and so forth. And what museum studies, from what I can see, is trying to do is to hijack museums and cultural organisations such as the National Trust to push a hardline cultural Marxist identity politics ideology and to use it as a way of propagandizing for an extreme politics. This is from an article taken from a blog called Impacting Museums, Exhibiting a More Socially Just World. And it's written by a woman called Jennifer Bergevin, who is a PhD researcher, and she works under Richard Sandel at the University of Leicester. He is her PhD, her doctoral supervisor, I believe. And let's just see what she says about the issue with Philbrick Hall and the National Trust. For centuries, white straight males have been at the epicentre of the museum world, dictating what was collected, displayed and how objects were interpreted. This conditioned the public to believe that this perspective is neutral, safe, devoid of politics. But indeed, nothing is further from the truth. For the National Trust, indeed for any heritage organisation, to choose to continue as it had been since the 19th century, with a focus on rich white landed gentry, to continue to ignore the contributions of LGBTQ people, women and people of colour, is a political decision. Well, so you see, there's the obsession with straight white males, which cultural Marxist identity politics has, whether this is feminism, whether it's LGBTQ agenda, whether it's so-called anti-racists. The straight white male is the big enemy. And she's taking the National Trust to task for, focusing on a rich white landed gentry? Well, there's a very simple reason for that. The properties, overwhelmingly, the properties that the National Trust own were owned by rich white landed gentry. And the reason people go and see those houses is because those were the people with the money who were rich enough to spend on building these magnificent buildings, expensive furniture, beautiful furnishings and furniture inside them. And that's what we pay our money to go and see. Nobody wants to go and see a suburban semi. So what did you expect them to do? That is the National Trust's raison d'etre, to preserve and conserve ancient buildings, where, by definition, rich, white landed people lived in the past. They're not living there now. They're dead. They've given their properties over to the National Trust. And people aren't actually going to see them because they were owned by white people. They're not particularly interested in the white, rich, landed gentry who lived there. Most of these people are fairly boring. I mean, poor old Robert Wyndham Ketton-Cremer at Felbrigg Hall in Norfolk wasn't exactly very exciting. I mean, he restored the property, good for him. But I mean, he didn't exactly live a terribly exciting life. I mean, it's not a life that most people are interested in hearing about. And that goes for most of the former owners of National Trust properties. I mean, occasionally you may have someone who was famous who lived there, but I mean, mostly they were just members of their social class who just got on with life and inherited the property onto their heirs. And people visit these properties to see the buildings and their contents. That's what they're interested in. And she says that, to continue to ignore the contributions of LGBTQ people. Well, simply not true. Felbrigg Hall has always recognised the contribution of Robert Wyndham Ketton-Cremer. I mean, they didn't say he was LGBTQ, but he didn't restore the building because he was gay. He restored it because he loved it and he wanted to restore it to its former glory. I mean, being gay had absolutely nothing to do with it. And women and people of colour is a political decision. Well, people of colour, I'm sorry, but I mean, up until, shall we say, the Second World War, the number of people of colour who are living in Britain, let alone in country houses and stately homes, was negligible, minuscule. So why would you mention people who weren't even living in these places at the time? It makes no sense whatsoever. And she continues, cultural institutions have the ability to reframe our understandings of history to include those who were forgotten, ignored and abused. Well, I'm sorry, but Robert Wyndham Ketton-Cremer and all the other owners of these houses who are taking part in the Prejudice and Pride campaign, or they've been included, they're not taking part, they're dead, but who included, could not be described as forgotten, ignored or abused. These were people who were living privileged lives. Robert Wyndham Ketton-Cremer was the owner of a large stately home in Norfolk. He was wealthy, he had enough money to spend on restoring his house, and he led a very comfortable and privileged life. To say that he was forgotten, ignored or abused is absolutely preposterous. And if he was gay, as he's alleged to be, he certainly wasn't persecuted or arrested or given a hard time for it. I mean, he was presumably protected, and people turned a blind eye, as people often did towards homosexuals at the time. But to describe a man of privilege as forgotten, ignored or abused, it just shows how far these people in the museum studies department and in academe are from real history and real life as it took place. Absolutely unbelievable. I'm just giving a flavour here. This is the department of the university that worked closely with the National Trust to develop the Prejudice and Pride campaign to mark the 50th anniversary of the legalisation of homosexuality in Britain. And what is clear is their political agenda is a cultural Marxist one, and they are simply prostituting organisations like the National Trust to push an agenda that most people do not agree with. And this needs to be known more widely. This is how I think it was it Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist, who talked about the the long march through the institutions, by which he meant soft revolution taking place quietly behind the scenes in the institutions of the Western world, and turning them gradually into havens of cultural Marxism. And that appears to be happening to the National Trust. The National Trust used to be, it was a place which was looking after part of our cultural heritage, the built heritage. And it meant that you could go there, you could visit these wonderful buildings and see their beautiful interiors, you could visit their gardens and enjoy them. They were not part of a politically radical agenda aimed at trying to change society from top to bottom and forcing people to do things which they were clearly very much against. Witness the events at Felbrick Hall and the treatment of the volunteers there. And this is a very sad and tragic direction that the NT is taking, and it really beggars belief how it has transformed in a very short time. Anyway, thank you for listening. If you've liked what you've heard, do subscribe, leave a comment. I'm expecting a certain amount of abuse for this one, and hopefully see you next time. Bye-bye.